Imagine a crown so heavy with the weight of 500 years of conquest that it could crush the neck of a god. Yet in the year 218 AD, this ultimate burden was placed on the head of a 14-year-old boy who preferred silk to steel. Picture this. You are a Roman citizen standing in the city gates, expecting to see a war-hardened general returning from the front lines. Instead, a strange procession appears, led by a teenager with painted eyes and shimmering robes, dancing backward toward the heart of the city. He isn't carrying a sword or a trophy. He is guarding a massive conical black meteorite that he claims is the only true god. Ever wonder how a civilization built on the cold logic of law and military discipline could fall under the spell of a child priest from the east? This was the beginning of a 4-year fever dream that would leave the Roman soul scarred forever. To understand this boy, we have to travel 2,000 miles away from Rome to the city of Emesa in modern-day Syria. In the 3rd century, this was a land of ancient mysticism and unimaginable wealth, far removed from the Stoic traditions of the Italian peninsula. The boy, known to history as Elagabalus, was the hereditary high priest of a sun deity whose temple was filled with gold and exotic incense. While Roman boys were taught to wrestle and study the law, Elagabalus spent his childhood performing hypnotic rituals around a stone that fell from the sky. Think of him as a young celebrity born into a cult of personality, where his every whim was considered a divine command. He was a foreign heart beating inside a Roman title, and the two were destined to clash like tectonic plates. Geographic isolation. He was raised in the East, where kings were treated like living gods, a concept totally alien to the Roman Republic's history. Religious fanaticism. His identity was tied entirely to a meteorite, making him more of a religious zealot than a political administrator. The power of women. His rise was orchestrated by his grandmother, Julia Maesa, who used her massive fortune to bribe soldiers into supporting him. Youthful ignorance. At 14, he had no understanding of the complex bureaucracy required to keep the grain flowing and the borders safe. His arrival in Rome was like dropping a drop of bright neon ink into a bucket of grey paint. It was never going to blend in. He didn't just want to be the emperor of the Romans. He wanted the Romans to become worshippers in his temple. The cultural shock was so intense that the air in the Senate house felt heavy with a sense of impending doom. He treated the most serious government on earth like a stage for his personal fantasies, forgetting that the Roman people were his audience, not his subjects. He was a sun rising over a city that preferred the shadows of tradition, and the heat he brought was about to burn the house down. Picture this. You are a soldier in the Roman legions, standing in the blistering heat of a Syrian military camp in the year 218 AD. You haven't been paid in months, and the current emperor Macrinus is a cold, stingy man who lives in fear of his own shadow. Suddenly a tent opens and a beautiful 14-year-old boy steps out, dressed in shimmering purple and smelling of expensive roses. He isn't just any boy, he is the nephew of the late beloved Emperor Caracalla, and more importantly, his grandmother is standing behind him with wagons full of gold coins. Ever wonder how much it costs to buy the loyalty of an entire army? For Elagabalus, the price of a crown was simply the weight of his grandmother's treasure chest. This wasn't a democratic election or a legal succession. It was a hostile takeover fueled by a teenager's face and a woman's bank account. The coronation of chaos was a masterclass in political manipulation and military bribery. Julia Maesa, the boy's grandmother, understood that Roman soldiers were more loyal to their wallets than to their oaths. She spread a rumor that Elagabalus was actually the secret son of the former emperor, giving the troops a blood reason to fight for him. Think of it like a massive marketing campaign where the product was a child priest and the target audience was a group of hungry, angry men with swords. On the morning of May 16th, the soldiers declared the boy emperor, and the civil war began. It was a battle between the old, tired establishment and a young, vibrant, and incredibly wealthy newcomer. Strategic bribery. Huge bonuses were promised to every soldier who switched sides, turning the Roman military into a mercenary force. The power of image. The boy's exotic beauty and priestly robes fascinated the soldiers, making them feel like they were fighting for a living god. The Battle of Antioch. The final fight was a messy, desperate struggle where the young boy's mother and grandmother actually jumped out of their carriages to stop the soldiers from retreating. Total victory. By the time the sun set, the old emperor was running for his life, and a 14-year-old was the master of the world. This victory was like giving a high-performance sports car to a child who had never even seen a roadmap. Elagabalus didn't win because he was a great general. He won because he was a symbol of change and a source of cash. As he began his long march from Syria to Rome, he didn't behave like a leader returning to his capital. He behaved like a god returning to his shrine. He ignored the advice of his generals and spent his time planning how he would change the Roman religion to fit his own desires. The crown was on his head, but the weight of it hadn't sunk in yet, and the Roman Senate was about to receive a guest they would never forget. Have you ever seen a situation where someone gets exactly what they wanted, only to realize they have no idea what to do with it? That was Elagabalus in the winter of 218. He was the emperor, but he remained a high priest at heart, and he refused to take off his silk robes to put on the traditional Roman toga. To the people in Rome, the news of his victory was a mixture of hope and confusion. They wanted a stable leader, but they were getting a boy who had never stepped foot in the capital. He was a king created by the sword and sustained by gold, a combination that rarely leads to a peaceful reign. The coronation was a spark that lit a fuse leading straight to the heart of Rome's ancient traditions. By the time the boy king reached the city gates, he had already decided that the Roman laws didn't apply to him. He was the sun, and everyone else was just a shadow. He didn't come to serve the empire. He came to make the empire serve his god. The coronation wasn't the end of the struggle. It was the beginning of a religious war that would push Rome to its absolute limit. He had captured the throne, but he was about to lose the respect of the very people who had given it to him. Picture this. You are a Roman priest standing in the ancient temple of Jupiter, the most sacred spot in the entire world. For 1,000 years, the golden statue of Jupiter has looked down on the city, the undisputed king of the gods. Suddenly, the heavy bronze doors swing open, and a teenage boy enters, followed by a team of soldiers carrying a massive, ugly black rock. He doesn't bow to Jupiter. Instead, he orders the ancient god of Rome to be moved to a side room. He points at the meteorite and declares that from this day forward, the king of the gods is no longer a Roman, but a Syrian stone. Ever wonder what it's like to watch someone try to delete your entire culture in a single afternoon? This was the beginning of a religious war that didn't use swords but used insults and ego to tear the city apart. The war on the gods was Elagabalus's way of telling Rome that their history didn't matter anymore. To a Roman, their gods were the reason they won wars and grew food. Attacking the gods was like attacking the foundations of a skyscraper. But Elagabalus didn't care about Roman tradition. He saw himself as the chosen one of the sun god, and he wanted to merge every religion into one giant cult centered around himself. Think of it like a new owner of a famous football team moving the stadium to a different country and changing the team colors to something nobody likes. He wasn't just a leader, he was a religious wrecking ball, the sun above all. He placed his black stone at the absolute top of the divine ladder, forcing every Roman official to pray to it before doing any business. The sacred marriage. In a move that shocked the world, he married his sun god to the Roman goddess Minerva, physically moving their statues into the same bedroom. Massive sacrifices. He slaughtered hundreds of bulls and sheep every single morning, drowning the altars in so much expensive wine that the floor was a slippery, bloody mess. Ignoring the Senate, when the leaders of Rome complained, he simply danced around the stone for hours, ignoring their words as if they were buzzing flies. This religious revolution was like trying to replace the air people breathe with something sweet and thick. It was beautiful to the boy, but it was suffocating everyone else. He wasn't just changing the names of the gods, he was changing the vibe of Rome from a military power to a mystical temple. The smell of the city changed from leather and iron to exotic perfumes and burning spices. He spent his days in a trance, convinced that the sun was speaking directly to him, while the people in the streets began to whisper that their emperor was possessed by a demon. He was a boy lost in a dream of his own making, and he didn't realize that the Roman people were starting to have a nightmare. Have you ever seen a leader who becomes so obsessed with their own ideas that they lose touch with reality? That was Elagabalus in the year 219. He didn't understand that for a Roman, religion and law were the same thing. By breaking the religious rules, he was breaking the law, and that made him a criminal in the eyes of his own subjects. He treated the most sacred rituals of the empire like a game of make-believe, dressing up in gold-threaded tunics that cost more than a soldier's yearly salary. He was a child playing with fire in a room full of gunpowder, and he was smiling as the sparks began to fly. The war on the gods was the moment the Roman elite realized their new emperor wasn't just young, he was dangerous. They could handle a greedy king or a lazy king, but they couldn't handle a king who wanted to kill their soul. By trying to force his space rock on the city, Elagabalus turned his best friends into his worst enemies. He had the crown, and he had the palace, but he was slowly losing the one thing an emperor needs to survive: respect. The sun was shining brightly in his temple, but a dark cloud was gathering over the rest of Rome. Picture this. You are a Roman senator, a man who has spent his entire life wearing the heavy white wool toga that symbolizes power, discipline, and old-school masculinity. You walk into the imperial palace for a meeting, but you don't find a soldier in armor. Instead, you see a teenager reclining on a mountain of silk cushions, his eyes darkened with heavy black coal, his skin smelling of expensive myrrh, and his hair covered in a wig of shimmering gold thread. He isn't wearing the Roman wool. He is draped in transparent fabrics from the east that leave nothing to the imagination. Ever wonder what happens when a culture built on the image of the Iron Man is suddenly ruled by someone who wants to be a golden goddess? This wasn't just a change in fashion, it was a total war on the gender roles that held the Roman social order together. The silk, coal and gender defiance of Elagabalus was a shockwave that hit the very heart of Roman identity. To the Romans, a man's clothing told the world who he was, a warrior, a father, and a leader. But Elagabalus looked at these rules and laughed. He preferred the delicate touch of Chinese silk and the sparkle of precious jewels sewn into his shoes. Think of it like a tough military general suddenly deciding to run a war room while wearing a high-fashion evening gown and heavy makeup. He wasn't just being rebellious, he was exploring a part of himself that the ancient world had no words for. He was a bird of paradise trapped in a cage of grey stone. The rejection of wool. He claimed Roman wool was too rough for his skin, choosing instead to wear only the most expensive, colourful silks from the Silk Road. The search for surgery. He famously offered massive fortunes to any doctor who could perform a primitive form of gender-affirming surgery, wanting to physically transition into a woman. The titles of power. He often asked to be called lady or queen rather than emperor, and he spent more time in the kitchens and spinning wool with women than in the war room. The makeup rituals. He spent hours every morning in front of a mirror, using lead-based paints and exotic dyes to transform his face into a mask of feminine beauty. This defiance was like trying to plant a tropical flower in the middle of a frozen battlefield. It was beautiful to the eye, but it couldn't survive the cold reality of the environment. The Roman soldiers looked at their queen and felt a deep, burning shame. They wanted a leader who looked like them, bled like them, and dressed like them. By choosing beauty over brawn, Elagabalus was effectively telling his army that he didn't belong to their world. He was a pioneer of self-expression in a time that demanded total conformity, and that made him the most isolated person in the empire. Have you ever seen someone stay true to themselves even when the entire world is telling them they are wrong? That was Elagabalus in the year 220. He didn't care about the whispers in the hallways or the angry stares from the guards. He lived in a world of mirrors and silk, convinced that his beauty was a gift from the sun god. But in Rome, beauty was for statues, not for rulers. He was a young person trying to find his true identity while sitting on a throne that required him to be a stone-cold killer. He was a soul born in the wrong place and the wrong time, trying to paint his way out of a corner. The silk, coal and gender defiance of the boy king was the ultimate insult to the Roman spirit. It proved to the elite that the emperor wasn't just different, he was un-Roman. By painting his face and wearing silks, he was stripping away the mystery of the imperial office. The soldiers began to feel that they weren't serving a man, but a ghost or a dream. He had the crown, and he had the makeup, but he was losing the armor of his reputation. The sun was shining on his shimmering robes, but the cold steel of the legions was already being sharpened in the dark. Picture this. You are a guest invited to the imperial palace for the most exclusive dinner in the world. You sit at a table carved from solid silver, surrounded by the scent of 1,000,000 crushed lilies. The young emperor smiles at you, his fingers dripping with emeralds, as servants bring out platters of peacock brains and flamingos' tongues. But as you reach for your wine, you notice something strange. The doors have been locked from the outside. Suddenly the ceiling opens up, and a literal mountain of rose petals begins to fall. At first it's beautiful and fragrant, but then you realize the petals aren't stopping. They are filling the room, rising to your waist, then your chest, then your face. Ever wonder what it's like to drown in the smell of spring? This was the banquet of death, where the line between a luxury party and a mass execution was as thin as a silk thread. The banquet of death was Elagabalus's way of turning the Roman Empire into a giant, twisted practical joke. To the Romans, a dinner party was a place for serious political talk and building alliances. But to a teenage boy with unlimited gold, it was a stage for pranks that would make a horror movie villain blush. He didn't just want to feed his guests, he wanted to play with them like a cat plays with a mouse. Think of it like a billionaire hosting a gala where half the food is made of plastic and the chairs are wired with electricity. He wasn't just a host, he was a bored god looking for a laugh at the expense of human lives. The fake feast. He often served dishes made of wood, wax, or stone that looked exactly like real food, forcing the hungry elite to sit and watch him eat real delicacies while they stared at painted carvings. The lion's surprise. He would frequently release tame but terrifying lions, leopards and bears into the dining room after his guests had passed out from wine, just to watch them wake up in a state of heart-stopping terror. The gold-dusted death. He served peas mixed with gold pieces and lentils mixed with precious gems, a move that was meant to show that in his world money was as common as dirt and just as tasteless. The fatal flowers. The infamous rose petal incident was his most famous stunt, where he allegedly smothered several high-ranking guests to death, simply because he wanted to see if beauty could kill. This decadent cruelty was like pouring sugar into a gas tank. It looked sweet and expensive, but it was destroying the engine of the empire. The Roman senators who survived these dinners didn't leave feeling honored, they left feeling humiliated and afraid. They realized that their lives were being held in the hands of a child who saw them as nothing more than toys. The war before law had moved from the temple to the dinner table, and the smell of death was starting to overpower the smell of the perfume. He was a boy living in a dream, but for everyone else, the dream was becoming a bloody nightmare. Have you ever seen a person who is so rich and so bored that they lose all sense of right and wrong? That was Elagabalus in the year 221. He didn't understand that a leader needs the love, or at least the fear of his people to survive. By turning his guests into victims, he was effectively telling the Roman elite that they were worthless. He spent his nights laughing at the terror he caused, convinced that his crown made him untouchable. But in Rome, a crown was only as strong as the people who were willing to stand behind it. He was a child playing with a loaded gun, and he was pointing it at his own feet. The banquet of death was the moment the Roman upper class decided they could no longer live under this boy's rule. It proved that the emperor wasn't just different, he was insane in their eyes. By making a mockery of Roman hospitality, he was breaking the final social bond that kept him safe. The soldiers heard the stories of the rose petals and the lions, and they felt a deep, cold disgust. He had the gold, and he had the palace, but he was losing the ground beneath his feet. The sun was at its highest point, but the shadows were growing long and sharp. Picture this. You are a high-ranking official walking through the corridors of the imperial palace, the nerve center of the Roman world. You expect to meet the Secretary of State or a seasoned general to discuss the grain supply for millions of citizens. Instead, you are stopped by a man whose only qualification for power is that he is the best-looking chariot driver in the city. Behind him stands a former barber who now manages the entire imperial treasury, and a track athlete who has been promoted to a general because of his physical grace. Ever wonder what happens to a superpower when the resume is replaced by a beauty pageant? This was the Palace of Scandal, where the most serious government in history was handed over to a group of pretty faces who didn't know the first thing about the law. The Palace of Scandal was Elagabalus's way of showing Rome that he didn't care about experience or tradition. To the Romans, holding a high office was something you earned through decades of military service and political struggle. But to a teenager with a crush, a high office was just a gift to be given to his favorite companions. Think of it like a new CEO firing all the experienced engineers and replacing them with his favorite TikTok influencers just because he likes their style. He wasn't just a ruler, he was a fanboy who turned the Roman government into his personal social club. The charioteers rise. He appointed Hieroclus, a blonde slave from Caria, as his husband and attempted to name him Caesar, giving him more power than the oldest senators. The barber's treasury. He put a man whose only skill was cutting hair in charge of the empire's taxes, leading to a financial disaster that nearly broke the Roman banks. The 5 marriages. In just 4 years he married and divorced 5 different women, including a sacred Vestal virgin, a crime that usually resulted in the woman being buried alive and the man being executed. The female senate. He established a senaculum, a mini-senate for women led by his mother, which debated fashion, etiquette, and palace gossip instead of war and peace. This scandalous management was like trying to navigate a massive ship through a storm using a crew of dancers. It was graceful to watch, but the ship was hitting every rock. The Roman elite didn't just feel insulted, they felt the entire system was rotting from the inside out. They watched as the most sacred offices of the state were sold or given away as romantic favors, realizing that their titles now meant absolutely nothing. The war before law had moved from the dining room to the halls of government, and the smell of corruption was starting to choke the city. He was a boy living in a romantic fantasy, but for the Roman state, the fantasy was a death sentence. Have you ever seen a leader who promotes people based on loyalty and looks rather than skill and wisdom? That was Elagabalus in the year 221. He didn't understand that an emperor is only as strong as the people he listens to. By surrounding himself with actors and athletes, he was cutting himself off from the reality of the empire. He spent his days in the arms of his favorites, convinced that his love was more important than the safety of the borders. But in Rome, the borders were protected by iron, not by affection. He was a child building a house of cards in the middle of a windstorm, and he was laughing as the first cards began to flutter away. The Palace of Scandal was the final proof the Roman military needed to know that their emperor was a liability. It proved that the boy king wasn't just strange, he was incompetent in their eyes. By making a mockery of the Roman career path, he was breaking the hearts of the very soldiers who had put him on the throne. The guards at the palace gates watched the charioteers and barbers walk past with royal authority, and they felt a deep, silent fury. He had the crown, and he had the favorites, but he was losing the respect of the men with the swords. The sun was starting to dip toward the horizon, and the air was getting cold. Picture this. You are standing in a hidden garden of the imperial palace, watching a quiet, silver-haired woman as she sips her wine and watches the teenage emperor from a distance. She is Julia Maesa, the boy's grandmother, and she is the true architect of this entire era. While Elagabalus is busy throwing rose petals and marrying chariot drivers, she is the one reading the secret reports from the borders and counting the gold in the basement. Ever wonder what it's like to realize that the person you put on the throne is actually the greatest threat to your family's survival? This was the grandmother's shadow, where the woman who created a king began to plan how to destroy him. The grandmother's shadow was a cold-blooded lesson in political survival over family loyalty. Julia Maesa didn't put Elagabalus on the throne because she loved him. She did it because she loved power and wanted her family to stay at the top of the Roman food chain. But as she watched the boy paint his face and insult the generals, she realized that the Sun King was about to cause an eclipse that would kill them all. Think of it like a master puppeteer who realizes their favorite puppet has started to catch fire. If she didn't cut the strings soon, her own hands would get burned. The power behind the throne. While Elagabalus was dancing in the temple, Maesa was the one actually attending the serious meetings and making sure the soldiers stayed fed. The search for a backup. She began to groom her other grandson, Alexander Severus, a boy who was the exact opposite of Elagabalus, quiet, respectful, and traditionally Roman. The propaganda war. She started whispering to the guards that Elagabalus was too divine for this world, and that Rome needed a real man to lead the legions. The forced adoption. In a move of pure genius, she forced Elagabalus to officially adopt his cousin Alexander as his son and heir, effectively signing the boy king's death warrant. This betrayal was like a slow-acting poison hidden in a sweet drink. Elagabalus didn't even taste it until it was too late. He thought his grandmother was his biggest supporter, but she was actually his most dangerous predator. She watched as the soldiers began to cheer for Alexander and ignore the emperor, knowing that she was the one who had choreographed every single cheer. The war before law had moved from the palace halls to the family dinner table, and the air was thick with the smell of a coming execution. He was a boy lost in a romantic dream, but his grandmother was wide awake and holding a dagger. Have you ever seen a situation where the person who loves you the most is also the one who knows exactly how to hurt you? That was Elagabalus in the year 221. He finally realized that his cousin was stealing his spotlight, and he reacted like a jealous child, trying to strip Alexander of his titles and even attempting to have him assassinated. But every time he attacked his cousin, his grandmother stepped in to protect the new favorite. He spent his days screaming in the palace, realizing that even his own family had turned into a den of snakes. But in Rome, a leader who loses his family loses his shield. He was a child realization that the world didn't revolve around him after all. The grandmother's shadow was the moment the countdown to the end officially started. It proved that the boy king was now a dead man walking in the eyes of the people who mattered. By choosing his cousin as the new face of the empire, Julia Maesa had effectively told the world that Elagabalus was a failed experiment. The soldiers at the gates looked at the young Alexander and saw hope, while they looked at Elagabalus and saw a joke that had gone on for too long. He had the crown, and he had the palace, but his own shadow was starting to pull away from him. The sun was almost gone, and the long night was about to begin. Picture this. You are Sultan Sanjar, the Praetorian Guard, standing in the cold, echoing hallways of the imperial barracks in March 222 AD. You are tired of the smell of perfume, tired of the silk-draped teenagers, and tired of being told to bow to a black rock from space. You look to your left and see the young Alexander Severus, modest, Roman, and respectful. You look to your right and see Elagabalus, screaming in a high-pitched voice, ordering you to arrest his own cousin for being too popular. Ever wonder what happens when the men with the swords finally decide they've had enough of the person holding the gold? This was the final betrayal, where the wall of steel that protected the emperor suddenly turned its points toward the throne. The final betrayal was the inevitable explosion of a 4-year pressure cooker. Elagabalus had spent his entire reign treating the military like an annoying background noise, but he forgot that in Rome the military was the only noise that mattered. When he tried to strip Alexander of his titles and remove his name from the public records, the soldiers didn't follow his orders. They revolted. Think of it like a king ordering his bodyguards to attack his own reflection, only to realize the bodyguards prefer the reflection to the man. He wasn't just a leader in trouble, he was a pilot who had jumped out of a plane and realized he never bothered to put on a parachute. The failed assassination. He sent secret messages to have his cousin Alexander poisoned, but the palace cooks loyal to his grandmother poured the toxin down the drain instead. The barracks confrontation. He went to the military camp to personally demand that the soldiers obey him. But instead of cheers, he was met with a wall of silent, angry stares. The last decree. In a moment of pure panic, He tried to dismiss the entire Praetorian Guard and told them to go home, effectively leaving himself completely unprotected in a palace full of enemies, the hiding place. As the soldiers drew their blades and began to hunt him through the halls, the most powerful man in the world was reduced to crawling through the palace latrines, hoping the filth would hide him. This collapse was like a giant dam finally bursting after years of tiny cracks. Once the water started moving, nothing could stop the flood. Elagabalus realized too late that his divine status meant nothing to a hungry soldier with a sharpened gladius. He spent his final hours running through the secret passages of the Palatine Hill, clutching his mother's hand, realizing that all the silk and gold in the world couldn't buy him a single minute of safety. The war before law had moved from the Senate House to the very mud and stone of the barracks, and the air was thick with the metallic tang of blood. He was a boy who thought he was a god, but he was about to die like a hunted animal. Have you ever seen someone realize they've lost everything in a single freezing moment of clarity? That was Elagabalus as the soldiers smashed through the doors. He didn't die in a heroic last stand or with a famous speech. He died screaming for mercy that he had never shown to the traditions of Rome. The soldiers found him huddled with his mother, Julia Soaemias, and they killed them both where they stood, showing no respect for their royal blood. But in Rome, royal was a title you earned every day through strength, not a gift you were given by birth. He was a child who had played a game he didn't understand, and the game had finally played him. The final betrayal was the moment the sun finally set on the strangest era in Roman history. It proved that the empire's immune system was still working, even if it had to cut out its own heart to save the body. By killing the boy king, the soldiers felt they were performing a surgery to remove a cancer that was eating away at their identity. The palace was suddenly quiet, the smell of incense replaced by the heavy silence of a fresh crime scene. He had the crown, and he had the palace, but now he had nothing but a few feet of dirt. The long night had arrived, and the sewer of history was waiting. Picture this. You are standing on the banks of the Tiber River as the grey dawn of a cold March morning breaks over the city. A massive, angry crowd has gathered, but they aren't here for a festival or a triumph. They are watching as the elite soldiers of Rome drag two blood-stained bundles through the dirt and stones of the riverbank. One of those bundles was, only hours ago, the most powerful human being on the planet, the High Priest of the Sun, the Master of Rome, the boy king Elagabalus. Ever wonder how a journey that began in a golden temple in Syria could end in the literal muck of a city drain? This was the sewer of history, the final brutal act of a tragedy that proved Rome would rather destroy itself than be led by someone who didn't respect its soul. The sewer of history was a ritual of absolute erasure that the Romans called damnatio memoriae. It wasn't enough to kill the emperor, they had to delete him from existence. The soldiers tried to shove his body into the public sewers, but when the narrow pipes wouldn't take him, they tied heavy stones to his feet and hurled him into the river like a piece of diseased meat. Think of it like a hard drive being wiped clean after a massive virus nearly crashed the entire system. He wasn't just a dead leader, he was a mistake that the empire was trying to forget ever happened. The erasure of names. Stone carvers across the empire spent weeks chiseling his name off public monuments, leaving jagged, empty holes where his titles used to be. The death of the stone. The massive black meteorite, the god he had brought from the east, was unceremoniously sent back to Syria, stripped of its Roman honors. The return to tradition. His cousin, the young Alexander Severus, was immediately crowned, and his first act was to bring back the old gods and the old wool togas. The ghost in the records. For centuries afterward, Roman historians wrote about him as a monster, a pseudo-emperor, who was used as a warning of what happens when a ruler loses their way. This total rejection was like a body's immune system attacking a foreign organ. The empire had survived the virus of decadence, but it was left exhausted and weakened. The Roman people moved on, but the scars remained in the way they viewed their leaders. They realized that a crown didn't make a god, and a throne didn't make a man. The war before law had ended with the law winning, but at a price that would haunt the coming centuries of Roman decline. He was a boy who wanted to be a star, but he ended up as a shadow at the bottom of a river. Have you ever looked at the modern world and seen the same patterns of ego, celebrity, and the obsession with luxury over duty? The story of Elagabalus isn't just an ancient tale, it's a mirror. We live in an age of influencers and leaders who sometimes care more about their image than the people they serve. History tells us that when a society values the show more than the substance, it begins to crack from the inside. Elagabalus was the first celebrity emperor, a man who lived his life for the applause and the aesthetic, only to find that when the music stops, the silence can be deadly. The big human lesson of the boy king is that power is a mirror. It doesn't change you, it just reveals who you truly are. If you are empty inside, the gold and the silk will only make that emptiness louder. Elagabalus had the world at his feet, but he didn't have a map for his own heart. He tried to turn a serious empire into a playground, forgetting that playgrounds have fences and empires have borders. He remains a colourful, tragic figure in the grey pages of history, a warning that even the brightest sun must eventually set if it forgets why it rises. The story of the boy who ruined Rome teaches us that a leader's true legacy isn't written in silk or rose petals, but in the strength of the foundation they leave behind. Rome survived Elagabalus, but it was never quite the same again. The mystery of the emperor had been broken, and the soldiers now knew that they were the ones who truly held the keys to the world. As the Tiber River carried his remains out to sea, the Queen of Cities turned its back on the sun and began the long walk toward the dark. In the end, Elagabalus didn't just lose his life, he lost his place in the human story, becoming a ghost in a gown, forever trapped in the sewer of history. True power is not about being seen, it is about being worthy of the vision.